Hey YouTubers, I'm Helen and welcome to Helen's House and Garden. Today I'm going to show you how to lacto ferment tomatoes. Lacto fermentation, not something that we hear much about in the UK. It's a fairly new subject to me, and I tried some tomatoes which I lacto fermented and they were so good. I'm going to show you how to do it. You may have heard of things like sauerkraut, and that is a lacto fermented product, and I will go on in another YouTube video and show you how to make sauerkraut. So tomatoes, really simple. It's a good one to start off with. If you like pickles, you might find that you like lacto fermented products as well. It's kind of one of those progression things. So what we need is some salt, and we need non-iodized salt, so Himalayan, pink Himalayan rock salt or sea salt's fine. Most of the salt we have here in the UK doesn't have iodine in it, and if it has got iodine in there, it will tell you actually on the packet. The iodine stops the lacto fermentation process, so that's why it's so important. So receptacle to weigh out your salt, some water. I always use non-chlorinated water. If you don't have access to that, all I've done today is poured a jug of water some hours earlier and left it to stand. The chlorine just evaporates into the atmosphere, so once it's been stood at room temperature for a couple of hours, you're good to go. 2 mason jars, I'll show you how to use those. Some form of lid, and this one's a pickling pipe, they're sometimes called. You can use a normal lid, but you're going to have to be careful to not screw a normal lid on too tight, because lacto fermentation produces gas, and gas in a confined area causes explosions. Don't want that, very messy. A spoon to weigh out your salt with, and I've chopped a clove of garlic and half a small red onion to go in with the tomatoes which I've got here. So I've just got a pack of pre-washed cherry tomatoes and remove the stalks. Also you need scales. I've got 2 sets of scales. One is a small weight scale, so that's handy for weighing out small measures like salt, and then a larger set of normal kitchen scales. If you haven't got a small set of scales, maybe you've got one of those measuring spoons which you can use to weigh out smaller measures. Now we're going to need a 2% brining solution, and 2% is important because we're fermenting the product, and the salt keeps out all the bad bacteria, but the good bacteria, the lactobacillus, can live in a brine solution, and it's the lactobacillus that we want to encourage to grow into the brine solution so that we can ferment these tomatoes. Easiest way to do this. It can get really complicated working out 2% and tipping and pouring things, so I've got this one down to a fine art, so this is why it's so good to start with. So pop your jar that you're going to use, and it's a wide top mason jar, and just fill it up with the tomatoes, with your onions. You don't have to put onions and garlic in here. I made my first lot without, I made the second lot just with some onion in there, and I thought, well, today let's pop some garlic in and see what flavour that produces. I think it's going to be quite good. Now, important that you firm them down, because you want everything in the jar to be below the actual water line. So I think we're going to be good to go with kind of that much of a gap at the top. And as I say, the solution will start to ferment, so you will get some gas and bubbling, so the tomatoes might actually start to rise up in the jar, so you need that little bit of headspace in there. So I'm going to put my scales on, and I'm going to zero them. So that gives me a negative weight on the scales, and I'm going to tip the water in because I just want to weigh the amount of water. Weighing everything like this is the easy way round working out exactly how much water that you've got. So almost up to the top, we're going to be able to squash those down below the water line, and I think there's a safe measure to go to. So now I'm going to tip out, hopefully without spilling too much, the water into the second mason jar, but not the tomatoes and not the onion and garlic. Now I actually forgot 3 mason jars is handy unless you know the weight of your mason jar. So I'm just going to weigh an empty mason jar, zero the scales, it's exactly the same jar, so I can now put on the jar with the water in which I've poured off from the tomatoes, and I've got 215 grams of water. So we need a 2% brining solution, so that means adding 2% of salt. Now to work out 2%, I can't do maths in my head particularly quickly, so using my calculator I'm going to put in 215 minus 2%, and that comes out at 4.3. Now 4.3 is the grams that we need in salt. Using my small weight scales, I'm going to use a small glass bowl, and we're going to weigh out 4.3 grams of salt. That's just over. And the important thing here is to not have too little salt, because if the brining solution is too weak, it will allow bad bacteria to grow. I'll just pop those out the way. All we do now is we've got our water, which is going to turn into brine. Pop your salt into the water and give it a good stir. You can use slightly warm water. It's not particularly cold in here today, so as the water's being stood out at room temperature, the salt should actually dissolve quite quickly, and there you go. That's all dissolved. And then all you do is pop the water into your jar back again. And that's your brine. Do you know, it already smells nice. If you like the smell of onions and garlic. So I'm just pressing them down just to kind of squash them into the jar and jam them in so they don't float. And there we go, they're nicely below the waterline. If you have any part of the tomato or the onion or garlic, as you can see, a piece is floating up to the top, so I'm just going to jam that down. If it's actually above the waterline, it will oxidise in the air, and as I say, it will encourage the bad bacteria. So pop your lid on. These ones we can screw down nice and tight. So once you've done that, you just pop it onto the side of the kitchen or in a cupboard, and after about 2 weeks the process will have completed. Some people leave them longer, and it's down to taste. You will be able to smell a type of sourness to the actual tomato, and you will see that there may be some slight cloudiness. Don't worry about that. If there's a milky cloudiness, that's okay. If you see any black things, that means that you've got bad bacteria in there, and I'm sorry, but you're just going to have to throw that out because that would make you ill. So as long as you see no black in there, it should all be good to go. After a week or so, it might be worth just taking off the lid and checking that everything is okay in there. And if you see anything within 24 hours popping up, it's okay to just poke it down. Now there's some other things that you can actually use to sink anything that's floating. You can put a cabbage leaf on the top, you can get glass weights to put on the top, but generally with tomatoes they're pretty good, and you can just leave them to go. Check on them, make sure that you haven't screwed your lid on too tight, because if you have, they will start to ooze down the sides. Okay. Lacto fermented tomatoes, it's really easy, they're really very tasty. I've got some that I made a good few weeks ago now, so it was the 25th of March, and as you can see there's a little bit of milkiness in the brine, and that's absolutely fine. And this is the one which I had red onion and tomato in. The brine is slightly pinky, and that's because the onions have leached out their colour, so that's absolutely fine. And really nice, slightly salty, slightly tangy on the onions, not hot at all like if you were to eat a raw onion. And the tomatoes, perfect, slightly fizzy. Some people like them really fizzy, so you're just going to have to make them and see how you go along and stop them at exactly the part of fizziness you like. These are just perfect. So there you go, lacto fermented tomatoes made easy. If you like this video, please hit like, subscribe. In comments, if you have any questions, hit me up for comments and I'll answer your questions. And don't forget to ring the bell so you get a notification of my next video. Take care.